We have a lot of different stories. There's stories about water. We call it tu'u. It's rising. So tu'u, the river Ishkesh, tu'u, the river is rising. There is a story about a man. His name's Patrihapihnich, which means old man rain.
I think in most cultures there are flood stories, and it's no different in our culture, the Wiyot culture, and we do have a flood story, and that is part of the creation story of who we are as a people. And in that, the woman makes a basket, and she put pitch in it so that basket would hold water. And she took her son and her daughter, and she put them in the basket and put preserves in the basket and put all kinds of things in it. Then she put a lid in on top of it, and she put it all together. And when the water came, the little girl and the little boy floats away, and then when the water recedes, they find themselves in this country. And we've been here ever since the times of the flood, and that's how we've come to live in this country we call Wiyot country.
Yeah, the impact of different human activities on some of these floods is a subject of controversy, and it's difficult, I think, to measure in some cases. But I think we can go back as far as the first really big flood after whites arrived, the 1861-1862 flood, and find that their activities had an impact on the water flow even that far back. That was a tremendous storm. It hit in the late fall and ran through the winter time. Out in Hoopa, where they measured, they had rainfall of 41 inches in November alone. And November is not supposed to be a real heavy rain month. It tapered off to 30-some inches in December and 20-some inches in January. And for the year, they had over 120 inches out there, most of it compacted into 3 or 4 months. The amount of water coming down the Trinity and the Klamath River was tremendous, and the way to gauge the level of that flood was the effect that it had on the Indian villages along the river. And you have to remember that the Indians had been there for a really long time, and they had seen high water levels, and they had figured out, well, where's the safe places to build our villages? And so they made sure that they built their villages along the Klamath, especially, much higher, or certainly somewhat higher, than where the highest flood water had ever come within their memories. So the 1861-1862 flood comes along, and guess what? It washes out some of their villages that were built specifically to be above any flood that had ever occurred within the handed-down, transmitted memory of the tribe. So it could be that this was just, a monster event that was much bigger than anything that happened in 1,000 years, say. But I think that the effects of it were exacerbated by the mining that had occurred on the Trinity and the Salmon and the Klamath River over the 10, 11 years that whites had been there.
This river has been up and down like a yo-yo. But in the old days, it was deeper. And everybody wants to blame everything, and I'm not sticking up for the loggers, but everybody wants to blame the loggers for everything. But what it was, my grandfather explained it to me because he helped build roads for, it was the Division of Highways back then, not Caltrans. They had no means to haul all the, I call it broadcast, all the stuff that, when you're digging in a bank to build a road. They built 101, followed the river. They built the railroad, followed the river, and shoved all that topsoil, everything, rocks and everything, it went into the river. They didn't haul it off. It just went over. So what that did is it filled the river bottom up. So when the river bottom gets filled up, it has to go up higher, right? And when it goes up higher, it takes in more land. And pretty soon it fills up even higher. And then all of a sudden it's like a snowball effect. Pretty soon it just keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And then when you have a big flood like, 55 and 64, people just don't realize the damage that was done back then. All that from Willits all the way down to Eureka, that whole railroad, they just shoved everything in the river. They didn't have any way to haul it off.
Well, in the Eel River Valley and in most of the river valleys in Humboldt County at least, you had a mix of people, but by 1964 there were agriculturalists, farmers and ranchers who were living in the river bottom areas, and you also had an influx of people since World War II who came in to do logging. That was a big change. Before World War II, you would have large lumber companies like Pacific Lumber Company sending workers out to temporary camps in the back country and cutting timber, and that happened in a number of places around the Pepperwood and Shively areas. But after World War II, you then had a lot of small, almost family-sized operations where they would set up their own mill and some small drainage and start cutting Douglas fir, which had not been cut much up until that time, and they got out of the redwood belt to some extent. So you had those sorts of people, and you had, at least along the Eel and the South Fork where the highway went, you had people who were associated with the tourist industry. And you had a lot of motels, you had some markets, you had fishing tackle shops that catered to the people who came up here to fish and swim and do things like that. So it was a mixed community by then compared to, say, 50 years earlier, when mostly it would have been ranching and very little of the other types of employment.
With all the rain that had fallen, it caused the river to swell quite extensively. And as the river swelled, it began to engulf many houses, businesses. It began to take over the mills. Of course, the mills were right on the river. It was the easy way for them to get the logs down the river. And the logs went really easily down the river. Not to mention, there was also mud, trees that were maybe rotted out, that weren't strong enough to withstand the force of the river. All of that began to flood down the river. And of course, in places like Weot, and then down in Scotia, and right on down into Ferndale, you saw all of this debris come. Fernbridge, to me, is a testament to construction. How that ever stood through the '64 flood was amazing. Looking at the pictures of all of the logs jammed up against it, it just created more of a barrier, more of a dam to slow that water down and press it up and force it to go around into the surrounding Eel River Valley. So you saw the Eel River Valley really saturated. Not just from that, that was just a small portion of the contribution to any sort of flooding that happened, but it didn't help any.
You remember Katrina? Well, Katrina was a huge impact to all levels of government, local, state, and federal. And in those highest impact areas along the Gulf, there was virtually a complete disintegration of local government because your infrastructure was wiped out. They couldn't do their job because they couldn't communicate, or they couldn't get from point A to point B. And so they lost their ability to talk, really. The only system that really worked was the private ham operators. We say hams are like ants, they're everywhere. They truly are. I mean, there's so many of them out there. They may not all affiliate with a local ham organization, but when disaster happens, they all seem to come up to the top and be ready and willing and able to function. And so when we lose infrastructure, we're confident that the ham radio infrastructure will still be operable.
I don't think I even thought of it as anything different than any other storm that came through. But when I woke up the next morning after the flood came ripping through the, Eel River, it was, Dad, look out the window, and Mom, can you see all this? Because we can see the water rising. through the week, and it was just tons of water. And we no longer could see the grass, in the landscape. It was just water. And when I told Dad and Mom to look out the window, when we opened up the curtains that one morning, it looked like the water had receded because it was all brown. Oh, wow, look at that. And then you had to, wake up and the daylight started coming in and realized it wasn't the ground we saw, it was timber and a few houses and wood and logs and all of that. And we're going, it just looked like there was ground again, but it wasn't. It was just covered over with the wood that had a couple of the several coal decks had washed out. A couple of houses had washed out into our area, and it was just amazing.
My second son had a two-story house right there, and it just picked it up off of whoever built it. They didn't attach it to the foundation. It just picked it up and went down. And I had some Indian baskets, and I had 2 baby baskets, and they were in my son's house. And that house washed down to Turwell Creek, where the little bridge goes across, and it went down in the creek and lodged. And after the flood, it was still there, and the baskets were still there. We got along real fine, but like I said, I had 22 people in the house, and that's only got 3 bedrooms. But we have quite a big attic, and we could have put them up there, but we didn't. They just put them on the floor.
In some cases, there was nothing left, to clean up. I remember the huge helicopters coming in with clothing and food, and one of the things in our community when there is disaster is because we usually only had 1 or 2 stores at the most. The stores get wiped out immediately, and only the families that did their own subsistence canning and grew their own vegetables and things were probably, fine for 30 days or plus. But there were many of our families who ate sea rations, which were quite the novelty, actually. And I remember thinking, too, in the clothing that was brought, there was like formals and all kinds of, crazy kind of clothing that we just kind of laughed about. It's like, why would we use that now, But there were also things like jackets and blankets and, things that we could actually use.
We have over 100 years of observations, meteorological observations, sitting back in our storage room, going back well into the 1800s. And this book is the book of observations from 1964. So this is where you'd see the flood, this is where you'd see the tsunami, and everything else happened in 64 weather-wise in the area of Eureka. 15th. So here's the 18th of December. You can see it started raining here in the second column. And then it kept raining every day, just a little bit at least. This is the 20th, had a little bit of a break, but still some precip. And then the 21st, it rained. 22nd, it rained. 23rd, it rained. 24th, it rained. Christmas Day, day after Christmas, right on through the end of the month, we have measurable rain every day here at the office. Right on through the 31st, measurable rain. Pretty amazing.